So as you can see, you know, I've got my still life shell set up in a way where I feel like it's lit decently. I found an angle that I like, and then I went ahead and I translated it onto my paper with just kind of like a nice, clean contour line drawing. I use my 2H pencil for this. So it's light, you know, I got a little dark in some areas, but in reality, it's a pretty light drawing. These are very subtle lines. And I had to do some revision. It was a little too big at the bottom, so I had to taper that in. I still need to kind of fix up this top corner because it's a little, there it is. It's a little droopy. Kind of need to like have it more like out this way. But that's gonna be my start. And then from here, I can go ahead and get shading. So after I've got my contour lines, what I'm really looking for is where are my highlights? So what are the areas that I wanna leave bright white on my paper? So when I go in to sketch it, I don't wanna shade them at all. So I can see a couple areas, pardon my finger, like up in here. Well, that went away because of my finger. Here on the cap, a little bit on the ridge right here. So I'm seeing some of those areas where I really wanna leave a little bit of white. So then when I go down to my paper, you know, I went in with my 2H pencil. Let me get that focus better. Went in with my 2H pencil and just did a very, very light amount of shading. It looks darker than it should in the video, but on my paper. And I did leave some areas of white, just little specks of white, some striation here of highlight where no light will fall. So right now it doesn't look like much because everything I just did a very light pass of a super light gray with my shade. But that way I know that the areas I leave white, those are gonna be my highlights, and then everything else is gonna be at lightest this light gray. And then I'll go in there later and I'll just keep adding more and more and more shading in those areas while I leave my whites pretty much untouched. All right, next up, now that I've kind of got my contour line and my basic shading done, I'm looking now for like general shadow. And if I, you know, what I should do is like go out of focus on this. Let's see if I can make it sort of hazy. If you kind of break it down by squinting, you can kind of see where there's shadows here, here along the other side of the ridge, here. It gets darker, right? So what I'm gonna do now is then try to translate that onto my paper by just, you know, really kind of going in now. And I'm still in my 2H, but wherever there's shadows, I'm starting to just kind of like gradually add layers, kind of get those general shadow shapes in on my shell the way I see them reflected over there on the shell itself. So that's kind of the next step. Now I'm starting to push some of those values a little bit darker and delineate where those shadow shapes are. I'm not looking at little fine detail yet. I'm just getting the general shadow shapes. So next up, what I did is I just went ahead and I noticed that when I look at my shell, obviously the background, you know, my table, oh great, my table is darker than my shell and these highlights, right? So I just went ahead and started to do a light layer. So far, I'm still in my 2H pencil, but I started to darken the background a bit. I'll see how much I wanna go with that. But now those highlights can stand out even more. I'm gonna transition in a second to my, my HB and start to just push some of my values darker and see what details need to go in a little darker. I'm really gonna pay attention to, you know, some of these ridges. Let's see if I can focus that a little bit better. But yeah, some of these little ridges in here, there's a lot of nice line work that I can emphasize by leaving some of these kind of light, but darkening a lot of this stuff in here and really letting some of these light values pop out. So at this point, I'm in with my 2H, or sorry, my HB, I apologize, and a little bit with my 4B. And I'm just really starting to go in and push these values. So I've started to work in more of these details in the shell. These like bands, these shadows that you can kind of see when you look at the shell, how it's got these ridges, right? And so I'm really trying to evoke these lines, but I'm actually doing it less with actual lines. I'll see if I can kind of draw and hold this at the same time. I'm probably not that skilled. But I can go in and I'm just kind of like shading these kind of areas and gently, see, I'm not that skilled. Just kind of like adding a little bit of shadow. I'm just kind of like ghosting it. I'm just using the tip of my pencil to kind of like put these faint lines in, but they start to develop into these areas of shadow. So that lets me start to get some of these bands in that I'm seeing when I look at the shell right in there. I might have to go in later and lighten some of these values up. But again, even though they look light when I'm looking at them now, keep in mind they're not as light on, where am I? They're not as light here as my lightest highlights. Where's my pencil? There we go, right over here. So even though it might look a little dark over here, I want to keep those darker than my lightest areas that I want to leave white. So overall, I'm happy with how it's coming and progressing. So I'm starting just to add in some of these details now that I've gotten all my sort of main values established. I can go in and start to add detail and add some darker areas and lighter areas. And I leave some areas kind of alone. Like I kind of worked around these sort of knobs on the shell so that they stay light. So I added shading around it, but I kind of left this be. And that's how I'll let those kind of pop forward the way they do down here. So we're working on it.